Hello and welcome to my channel, The Curious Coder. In this video, we are going to talk about a very important Java core interview question. What's the deal with equals and hashCode? Now at first glance, this might seem like a simple topic, but in reality, these two methods are almost everywhere in Java. Okay, you won't believe the number of processes where they quietly play a huge role. First off, every time you create and compare objects, Java relies on equals and hashCode to figure out if those two objects are exactly the same. Then in HashMap, hashSet and any other hash-based collections, their entire internal implementation depends on these methods. Even in string, all the string comparison and string pooling use these methods under the hood. And in Java 8 as well, when you use things like streams or collection APIs, these methods sneak in during comparisons and lookups. Alright, now the tricky part is that at times this question is not directly asked in an interview, but they do show up indirectly in tons of questions. Okay, and if you don't fully understand how they work, it's easy to miss the real logic. So in this video, I'll walk you through everything you need to know, how these methods behave, where these methods belong, how you can override them and give your own implementation, and most importantly, I'll tell you all the tricky ways they can show up in interviews. Alright, so let's get started. So I've created a class employee. It has two fields, ID and name. Now let's say I create an object of this class employee, e1 is equal to new employee. Okay, and let's say I set the ID as e1.id is 1 and e1.name is, let's say, Rahul. Alright, then I create one more object, employee 2, and I give some other values to the ID and name. Okay, let's say ID is 2 and the name is, let's say, Rohit. Okay, so we have created two different employee objects, and I have given different values to their fields. Okay, now let's say if I try to compare these two objects using the equals method. Okay, e1 dot equals e2, like this. So what should be the output of this? Okay, I'll also print this one, system.out.println. Yeah, so what should be the output of this? So by logic, it seems that it should return false. And if I run it, so yeah, it will return false, because you can see these are two different objects and we have two different values for the ID as well as for the name. Okay, now let's say the ID is same. Okay, both these employee objects have the same ID, but the name is different. Alright, now what? Now if I run it, again, it will be false. Okay, because still these are two different objects. Now let's say the name is also same. Alright, I'll change it back to Rahul. Okay, and now if I run it, again it will return false. Okay, so why? Basically, we need to understand how this equals method is implemented. Okay, what this equals method is and how actually it will compare these two objects. Okay, so see, the first question is, how can we even call this equals method? Because you can see in the employee class, we don't have any method, right? We have only created ID and name, and still somehow we are able to call this equals method with this e1 object, right? With an object of employee class. So why? That is because the first thing that you must know is that equals is a method that belongs to the class object. Okay, and object is the parent class of all the classes in Java. Alright, so that is why, since employee is a child class of object, basically every Java class is a child class of object. So every Java class can call this method equals. Okay, this is the first thing that we need to understand. Similarly, hashCode is also a method of this object class only. Okay, I'll come to hashCode little later in the video, but as of now you should know that both equals and hashCode are two methods of object class. Okay, and any class in Java can call these two methods. Alright, so now if you look at the implementation of this equals method, you'll see that eventually what it's doing is it's just using equal to. Okay, so as we know that this equal to is used to compare references, Okay, by references, I mean the memory address of the objects. So since these two objects, since we have created two objects, okay, and even though they have the same ID and same name, but their memory addresses are different. Okay, because I have created a new employee here and then I created a new employee here. So in the memory, they are at two different locations. Hence, that's why if eventually we'll do equal to on them, then it will compare the addresses and they will be on two different locations, so it will return false. Okay, and that's exactly what is happening. So even if you are calling the equals method, it's actually calling the equals method of object class, and which eventually is comparing the references. So that is why you are returning false even if the ID and name of both these objects are same. Okay, so that is the logic. Now let me do one more thing. Let's say I have a string s1 is equal to new string in which I give my name, and then I have another string, and let's say we try to compare these two strings. Okay, and both these strings have the same value. Now if I do, I'll again just copy paste this, and instead of e1 and e2, I'll take s1 and s2. Okay, so we can call equals using s1 and s2 because, as I told you, from any Java class we can call the equals method. Alright, now let's see the output. Great. So you will see that for this employee object it was false, but for this string object it's true. Okay, so why did that happen? So I'll show you. The logic is that if I go to this equals method, you will see that we are inside the string class. Okay, this is not object class, and there is some implementation of this equals method. All right, so what they did was string string has overridden this method of equals. Okay, because since it's a child class of object, so it override this method, and in this method it gave its own implementation. Okay, so string has added its own implementation, and I'll not go into like the depth of it, but basically if I'll show you, eventually what it's doing is it's taking every character, it's looping on every character, and it's comparing each character with one another, and if all are same, okay, then it will return true, and if any of it is not same, then it will return false. All right, so the main point that I want to tell here is that you can give your own implementation of this equals method. Okay, it's up to you how you want your object to be equal. Okay, what logic you want to give for comparing your objects. So string has given this logic that it compares each character, and if all the characters are equal, then in that case it considers the two objects of string to be equals. Okay, so that was the main logic, and in the employee class we have not implemented the equals object. That is why even though the ID and name are equal, still when we'll call the even.equals method, it will return false. But for a string, it will return true because they have already implemented this equals method. They have given an implementation of it. They are not using the default object classes equals method. Okay, so what we'll do is we will also try to give our own implementation of this equals method. Okay, so I'll just override the method. Okay, override this equals method. Great, and I will remove this. Okay, let's like what this is doing is it's just calling the parents method only again, which is object classes, so we don't want that. I'll give my own implementation. Okay, so let's say I just write return true. All right, and now if I just simply I'll comment this one out. Okay, let's just look into this even.equals e2, and if I run my project, you'll see that it returns true. Okay, but the values were same. Let's say even though the value are different, okay, this is 2 and this is again Rohit. All right, still if I'll run this, you'll say that it will still return true because that is how I implemented it. Right, in my equals method I gave the implementation that always return true. So it's up to me how I want my employee objects to be equal. So what I have given here is that I am saying that always any object of employee is equal. Okay, all the employees are equal. That is what I'm trying to say with this implementation. So it's totally up to you how you want to implement this equals, and that is how your logic becomes for comparing any two objects of that class. Okay, so but now we'll not do it like this because obviously it's not making any sense that why are all the employees equal. So I'll add some logic. Okay, so let's say my logic is, first what I'll do is I have this object here in the parenthesis. So what actually is this is like when we are calling it like this, e1 dot equals e2. So this e2 will come here, okay, in the form of object. So first I need to typecast it. All right, so let's say employee E will be something like this. Okay, so I've taken an employee E, and what I'll do is I'll just compare if E dot id is equal to this dot id, then return true, else return false. Okay, so what does this mean? That basically the object that we are passing here, if that's id is equal to this dot id. So by this dot id I mean the id of the employee object that is actually calling this method. So basically e1's id, if e1's id and e2's id are equal, okay, e1 here represents this. All right, e1 represents this and e2 represents this object. Okay, so if e dot id is equal to this dot id, then return true, else return false. So what I'm trying to say is that whenever we'll compare the objects, whenever we'll compare these two objects, if their IDs are same, then it should be true, otherwise it should be false. Okay, so let's check this out. As of now, the ID is different and the name is different. Okay, I'll just run it. So you'll see that it returns false. Okay, but if I made the ID to be same and then if I run it, then it will return true. Okay, so as of now I've given the logic that if their IDs are same, then these objects will be considered same even though their name are different. All right, similarly I can also add the logic of name as well. I'll say that ID should be equal as well as e dot name should also be equal to this dot name. Okay, so here I'm using equals only because these are string, and we already saw that in case of string, if the of all the characters are equal, then equals will return true. Okay, so I'm comparing it like this. So basically what I'm saying is now both ID and name should be equal. Okay, so if I go in the main class, as of now the name are different but ID is same. So if I'll run, it will return false. But if I make both these as same like this, now it will return true. Okay, so that is the magic of equals method. All you need to do is you need to override that method in your class and you have to give your own implementation. Okay, so it's up to you, it's up to your use case that how do you want your objects to be equal. Okay, you can take all the fields that you want to consider, and similarly you can write a logic. All right, so these are some different ways by which this question is asked. So what the interviewer will do, he'll just like write two objects, he'll create two objects and he'll say that both ID and name are different, and he'll just ask you, so what should be the output of this? Okay, and then he might make both these same and then again ask you, then now what should be the output of this? Also, this can also be done that he might take string values and then he might ask that what's the output when you compare string values using equals. Okay, so these are the different ways that the question will be asked, but you must know that the underlying logic behind all of this is equals method. Okay, so you have to tell everything that I just told you, that equals is a method which belongs to the object class, and you have to override that method and you have to give some own implementation. So first you will say that this will return false because as of now we don't have any equals overridden, but let's say eventually if you override the equals method, then you can give an implementation on your own and you can use both ID as well as name. So if you'll use that logic that both ID and name should be equal, then this will return true. Okay, and why does string already returns true? Because string has already implemented the equals method, and in this equals method it just compares using it just loops on every character and it compares every character. Okay, all this information you have to tell in the interview. All right. Now, what is hashCode? So, hashCode is also a method which is part of your object class, and it is used to create a hash value for your object. Okay, basically some unique integer value that will represent your object. Okay, and it is recommended that whenever you override the equals method, you should also override the hashCode method. Okay, it is a recommendation. It is a Java contract that is there. And let's understand this, that why should we also override the hashCode method along with equals. Okay, so here in the code you can see that we have only overridden equals method. All right, but still it's working fine, right? By fine I mean that when id and name are equal, then when I compare it with equals, then it will return true, right? As we earlier saw it, that it will return true. Okay, and also let me remove this string part. Yeah, but then why do we need hashCode? So there are some scenarios in which both hashCode as well as equals come into play. Okay, as of now what we are doing is we are just directly calling the equals method, right? So only equals is in the picture. But there are some scenarios where internally both equals as well as hashCode gets called. Okay, so what are those scenarios? Basically, one scenario is all the hashing based data structures. Okay, like hash set, hash map, hash table. All these data structures use hashCode as well as equals method internally. Okay, so let me show you. Let's say I have a hash set, all right, of this type employee. Okay, and yeah, is equal to new hash set. All right, so let's say I add E1 as well as E2. All right, now what I'll do is let me just comment this. Okay, let's work on this hash set. So now what happens is that whenever this add method is called, internally it uses equals as well as hashCode. Okay, so let me just show you how. What I'll do is I'll print the size of this hash set. Okay, system.out.println set dot size. Yeah, now see, the thing is that I hope that you know about this hash set, that it does not allow duplicate values. Okay, so like HashMap also does not allow duplicate keys. Similarly, hash set does not allow duplicate values. So let's say, for example, I had another hash set. Like I'll take a very simple example. Set1 is equal to new hash set, and it's a simple integer hash set. Okay, let's first see this. And if I add 1 and if I again add 1, all right, then these are two duplicate values. Okay, and if I'll print the size of this hash set, you will see that the size will come out to be 1. It will not be 2, because this hash set does not contain duplicate values. So okay, so it will only treat it as 1. All right, so let me just not print this as of now. Let's say I'll just run this. All right, so you can see that the size which is printed here is 1, even though we added 2 entries. But since these 2 entries were totally same, that is why in the set only one of it was added. Okay, basically it was replaced with the new one. All right, so similarly here in our example, what should be the size of this set? Okay, so it totally depends on that if these two objects are equal, that means the size will be 1, and if somehow they are not completely equal, then the size will be 2. Okay, that's the logic. So now let me run it. Great, so you will see that the size is 2. Okay, why? Even though we added equals here, we had a logic that this is an equals logic which says that if id and name are equal, then we must consider these two objects as equal, right? But still in the set the size is coming to be 2, which means that these two objects are not treated equal by this hash set. Okay, by the logic that it's using underline, right? So this is because, as I told you, these hashing based data structures calls both equals as well as hashCode method. Okay, and that is why there is a contract in Java that whenever you are overriding equals method, you must also override the hashcode method, because there are many processes which are internally using both equals as well as hashcode. Okay, so let me show you how. What I'll do, I'll just simply generate override methods, and we'll also override this hashcode method. Okay, and I'll not call super.hashcode. Okay, so as of now, let's say we have super.hashcode, and still if I run it, still the size is 2. Why? Because in the method which uh, I I didn't give my own implementation. Basically what I did was I just called the object classes hashcode. Okay, but I should always give my own implementation if I want some logic. So here we have used id and name to have this equals logic. Okay, similarly in hashcode also I'll use id as well as name. Okay, so how do we create this hashcode? Now see, the underlying logic behind hashcode is that we want to create some unique value. Okay, so let's not try to write a logic on our own. Okay, because there is already some logic written to create some unique value. But since we want to give our own implementation, so what we'll do is we'll make sure that we give our implementation based on id and name. Okay, so let me show you how. So what I'll do is I'll just take int id here, and I'll take, okay, not int id and name here. What I'll do is we have one objects class, all right, which already has a hashcode method inside it, like this. Okay, and this, okay, what's the issue? In the objects class we have hashcode, this one, yeah, this hash, my bad, yeah, this hash method. Okay, so see, this is not object class, this is objects, this is different. Let me just write the whole code and I'll explain what I'm trying to do. Okay, and what I'll do is I'll pass id and name here. Fine, so, and this I will return. Okay, so this is my implementation of hashcode method. Hashcode was a method in the object class. I override this method. All right, I just override this method, and in this method I used another hash function which is present there in the objects class. Okay, so why did I do that? Because I don't want to write the whole unique logic thing on my own. But then how is it my implementation? Because I have passed this id and name in this hash method. Okay, so what I'm trying to achieve is that this hash method, if you go inside this, somewhere there is some logic written that creates some unique value. Okay, and we don't want to understand this logic. Okay, it's a bit complex. We just take some prime number and we multiply it with something, and then we divide with something. But we must understand that it will try to create a unique value. Okay, but how it does is it takes the fields that will be used to create these unique values, and in those fields we are passing id and name. Okay, getting my point? So this is how we have given our own implementation. What we are trying to say is that if id and name are same, okay, if they are same for two different objects, then the hash code that will be generated will also be same, because in the end it's using some logic, and for that logic it's taking some inputs, and those inputs we are providing it, and we have provided id and name. So we are saying that if id and name are same for two different objects, then same hash code will be generated, because we are using this objects classes hash method which takes some fields as arguments, and we are passing id and name in that. All right, so now when I'll run the main method, you will see that the output is 1. Okay, now the size of the set is 1 because these two objects are considered totally equal. So what happened was, when we added this in the set, first E1 was added, then when we added E2, it compared E2 with E1. Okay, it compared E2 with all the objects that might have been there in this hash set, and for comparing that, it called both equals as well as hashcode method. So first it called the hashcode, in there it passed the id and name, and since it was same, okay, both the objects ID is 1 and Rahul, so same hash code would have been generated for both these objects. Alright, and then it called the equals method, and for equals we have given this logic that if their ID is same and their name is same, then return true. Alright, so since both these methods return the same thing, this returned the same hash code and equals return true, so then only the object will be considered as totally same. So that's why E1 and E2 are totally same, and hence the size of this set is 1. It's not 2. Alright. Now similarly we can change things in this hashcode method as well. We could have just, passed only the ID like this, and here also I'll not take name in the logic, I'll only take ID. So now what I'm saying is that if the ID of these two objects are same, then they must be considered totally equal. Okay, so you will see that even if the name is different and I run it, alright, the size of the set is 1. But let's say if I change the ID as well, then the size of the set is 2. Okay, so this is how we should work with equals and hash code. We can implement these two methods in our class. We can give our own implementations of these methods. So basically what we need to do is we need to provide the fields on the basis of which we will decide whether these two objects are equal or not. So here we will just pass the field, and here you can write some logic like this. Okay, that if both the IDs matches, then it's true. If they doesn't match, then return false. Alright, so you can see that this is another way that this question gets asked. What they do is interviewer will just create a set, and he will say that the set is of type employee, and now both the employee objects have the same value. Let's say both have 1 only, ID and name also same, and he will say that we are adding these two objects in the set. So you have to tell that what is the size of the set. Okay, so if you don't know all this logic, if you don't know what's the underlying logic behind hash set, the equals and hash code thing, you will never be able to guess that what's the correct answer, right? So this is how equals and hash code is asked indirectly in the interview, that hash set and all the hashing based data structures internally uses this equals and hash code. Okay, they call both these methods. So you must tell all these things in the interview again, that they must be called, and if in your class you would have overridden them and you would have provided ID and name as the criteria for matching the employees, then the size will be 1. If you have not overridden them, then the size will be 2, because they will be considered as two different objects. Okay, so I hope you understood the concept behind equals and hash code. You can try these things out yourself in your code base, and then you will get a clear and better understanding of what I'm trying to say. Okay.